Welcome to the Alcove. I'm Mark Molaro. My guest today is Arianna Huffington. She is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post and author of many books, including her latest, Right is Wrong: How the Lunatic Fringe Hijacked America, Shredded the Constitution, and Made Us All Less Safe, and What You Need to Know to End the Madness. Arianna, welcome.
Thank you.
Wondering about your thoughts about the general election. We're going into it right now. What are your thoughts on Barack Obama versus John McCain?
Well, I was asking that question of Tommy Schlamme, you know, the executive producer of West Wing. And he responded by talking about the last primary on Tuesday, when Barack Obama gave, his speech, kind of effectively claiming the Democratic nomination, and John McCain gave a speech in front of a lime green background.
Right.
And Tommy said it was a little bit like watching black and white television and then moving to high def. And there is something about that. There is something about John McCain, though he has this incredibly heroic bio and incredible past, being sort of out of sync with the times. I wrote last week about how he reminds me more and more of Bob Dole. Right. Another man who sacrificed for his country, even gave part of his body for his country. And yet this is not his time. The other thing that is so interesting is that even though the right has been so discredited, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy, John McCain is in a much better position despite that, because of his own image as a maverick, as an independent thinker, as a real leader. So that's going to be the challenge of this election, whether the public and the media will update their images of John McCain in time.
Now, you clearly admire Barack Obama. I'm wondering, how do you look at his candidacy? Is there anything that's happening right now that's a surprise to you, or is it playing out according to a certain kind of script that you expected?
Well, everything about his candidacy has been surprising. Mm-hmm. The fact that he's the nominee is surprising. He would not be the nominee were it not for the internet. He is the nominee because of who he is and because of the way he managed to master the internet. Right. He really translated the viral onto the street, the way Howard Dean failed to do. And he now has over 1 million donors, over 1 million friends on Facebook. Right. He's opted out of public financing because he's created his own small public financing reality. I think it was the right decision strategically, because he's going to be attacked and smeared mercilessly, as we've already seen. The attempt to feminize him, the attempt to make the American people feel that they cannot trust him to keep them safe. The way they did it with John Kerry, only I think it's going to be massively greater.
I'm wondering, in your new book, you talk about the lunatic fringe, and I'm wondering, do you expect that kind of campaign to be run by the GOP in the fall?
I don't expect anything good from this campaign in terms of what John McCain and the GOP will do, because John McCain has already surrendered who he was on issue after issue, from tax cuts. Remember, he said he could not vote for the Bush tax cuts in good conscience. These were his words, and now he wants to make them permanent. Yeah. On immigration, he said he would not be voting for his own immigration bill. On the agents of intolerance, which is what he called the religious right, and since then he's been kissing their rings. Of course, on the war in Iraq, it's been a completely delusional attempt to convince the American people that we are winning in Iraq, whatever that means.
Or that it's winnable, perhaps.
Or that it's winnable, yes, right. Provided we stay there indefinitely. So there's no question that John McCain was willing to sacrifice what made him an independent leader, what made him a maverick. So the campaign that is already being run and will be run, I think will end up using fear as their trump card, because what else are they going to run on? The economy, Iraq, food prices, gas prices, foreclosures. What are they going to run on except fear?
Do you expect as well anything in particular from the mainstream media? You talk in your book about how it's one of the key culprits to what we've had with this idea of the lunatic fringe. What do you expect in terms of the coverage from the mainstream press? Is there anything that we should be looking for in terms of, let's say, this kind of fear-mongering? Or do you get a sense that perhaps because of a lot of the new media, that maybe the press is starting to understand that it has to have perhaps a more balanced coverage?
Well, the problem with the press has been its idea of balanced coverage. Okay. That's why the first chapter in my book is called Equal Time for Lies, because the press considers sort of objectivity, presenting every side, presenting every issue as though it has two sides, even though it clearly only has one. The truth is often on one side or the other. It's not always to be found by splitting the difference, on Iraq, on global warming, on evolution, on corporate responsibility, on many, many issues. And that has been one of the problems with the media, because it's made it much harder for the public to be presented with the facts.
There's also been, of course, and everybody's very familiar with this, but with the media, such a focus on trivial stories. And you outline that very much in your book. Again, do you get a sense that that is going to continue to happen? Because when you look at the important issues that are going to happen in this campaign, do you trust that the press is going to cover those issues? Everybody keeps saying we're going to have a clear policy debate, that there's never been such clarity in terms of vastly different policy issues. Is there any way that this election is going to actually focus on policy?
Well, elections normally come down to one or two big issues. Elections are not normally the place where to debate the exact particulars of a healthcare plan or an energy plan. So the big picture items in this election are going to be national security and how can we turn the economy around. Now, I personally believe that in the end, contrary to conventional wisdom, this election will come down to national security. No matter how bad the economy gets, no matter how high food prices and gas prices get, in the end, fear trumps everything else. And if you appeal to people's fears, right, their lizard brain is activated. It overrides anything rational. And so since this is the only card, really, that John McCain and the GOP have, I believe that in the end it's going to come down to, do you trust Barack Hussein Obama, who 1/3 of the American people believe is Muslim or has some Muslim connection to keep you safe from the Muslims? Right. It's going to be, in the end, down to that very primitive level.
Now, it's interesting because you seem to have equal criticism for a lot of what the Democrats have done in the past. What do Barack Obama and his team, and with all the various elections, what do they have to do, perhaps to have a more muscular campaign? The idea of sort of learning the lessons of some of the failures of the past, what do they have to do?
Well, that's going to be the key, because I believe that Democrats lost in 2002 and 2004 because they ran to what they consider to be the middle. They basically went along with the president's war. They were not sufficiently critical of the execution of the war. And so what they presented to the American people was equivocations. Okay. Now, Obama has the great advantage that he's been against this war from the beginning. That in 2002, when conventional wisdom was solidly for the war, he gave a passionate, eloquent speech against it. Right. So provided he stays close to those beginnings of his candidacy, I think he's going to be in good shape.
When people talk about Barack Obama wanting to have sort of a spirit of bipartisanship, is that something that you sense with him? People have painted him as being so liberal in a lot of his voting in the Senate and things like that. When you imagine an Obama presidency, do you see him working in a bipartisan way? And with the sort of fractured debate that we've had, and often, like you say, elements of fear, is that even possible with the kind of gridlock that is in Washington right now?
It all depends on what we mean by bipartisan. You see, I think the center has shifted, and the American media haven't really clearly defined the new center. But we now have 60 to 70% of the American people who are solidly in favor of bringing the troops home, of wanting some form of corporate responsibility, wanting some form of universal health care, wanting to do something about global warming. So a lot of these positions, which were seen as left-wing, are now solidly mainstream. So Obama is in that center. So his job as a leader is to define the new American center, instead of allowing the media to present the debate as a battle between right and left. The right has shrunk dramatically. The right is down to that 23 to 28%, depending on which poll you look at, that still approves of George Bush.
Do you think, though, that like a lot of those sort of 60s culture wars that most of us are pretty sick of by this point, do you think that that really is an anachronism? Do you think that it's possible to get beyond it? And if we can, how do we do that? Like, how does, if somebody's watching this right now, what can an average person do to try to encourage their political leaders, regardless of which, part of the spectrum that they're on, to take that seriously? Because it seems like you're saying that a more utilitarian approach, regardless of your original values, is going to be the thing that will actually solve problems.
Well, what's happened right now is that there's so many real problems in the country. I mean, there's real pain. And so it's harder, I think, to distract people with fear-mongering about same-sex marriage. Right. When you're losing your home, when you have to take a second mortgage to fill your gas tank, and when you can't send your kid to college, you are not as easily convinced that if two men or two women marry, your own life is going to be at risk. So I think that's the good news about all those 60s cultural issues. I don't think they're going to have as big a resonance as they did in the past.
So do you think that exactly those wedge issues that Thomas Frank used to talk about, that maybe those Reagan Democrats will actually vote their economic interests first rather than on cultural issues?
Well, one of the interesting things this election is that Obama is expanding the electorate. So he's not just appealing to those swing Reagan Democrats who can go either way. He is going beyond the 50% of eligible voters who regularly vote in presidential races, and he's saying, how about looking at the rest of the 100%, the 50% that doesn't regularly vote? How about if we can get 10% of them to vote? We completely change and shake up all the pollsters and campaign consultants' predictions about the election.
Some people have considered your book and some of your political views as perhaps being polemical. I was just wondering, do you consider them polemical? And if you do, like for instance, the idea of using rhetoric, because some of the things in your book are quite strong, to use one opinion, and I'm wondering, is that by intention? Are you trying to kind of shake people up? Do you think that there are certain things that in that style of writing that you can reach people by having such strong opinions and then trying to back them up?
I think the most important thing as a writer is to be absolutely clear about the facts. Facts are sacred. And I have like an obsession about that, both in my own books and in the way we run the Huffington Post. So that is really the most important thing. The language you use in presenting the facts is just, for me, the most powerful language I can use to convince people. I feel a little bit like a lawyer. This is a legal brief.
You're making a case.
And as long as my facts are solid, then I will use whatever language I can use to convince people of what I'm saying.
Do you feel that you've paid a price for being so passionate about what you believe in? How do you look at some of the criticism that is leveled at you for being, essentially for being such an advocate for what you believe in? How do you sort of look at that criticism?
I don't really think I've paid any price. I think that, on the contrary, I think it's who I am, and it's as much who I am as my accent or any other part of me. I feel I'm passionate. I find that if I really believe something, I want to put my entire being behind it, not just not just my head, but everything about it.
I'm wondering as well, was that part of the design of the Huffington Post? I wonder if you can take us back a few years about when you first conceived the idea of it and what the original aims were and what they are now.
We are just over 3 years old, and we started wanting to bring together, three different things. News with our own point of view, by which I mean, as I.F. Stone said, the interesting thing in Washington is what page of the Washington Post the front page story is going to be.
Okay, yeah.
So it's like, for us, it's like picking what we consider the most important story and putting it at the top of our homepage. And staying with different stories long after the mainstream media may have given up on them. Jay Rosen called the blogosphere the Court of Appeals, and in a sense we are the Court of Appeals. We can give a story a second chance if the mainstream media have passed on. So that was the first thing, news, 24/7 news. Then opinion. We have over 2,000 bloggers who can write at any time on anything, including living and media and business, not just politics. And community. From the beginning, we've had a thriving community. We had 600,000 comments last month. So our community is a very big part of what we're doing. And an extension of our community was really Off the Bus, which was our citizen journalism project that has become a big part of this campaign, to everybody's surprise.
Well, it's interesting, too, because looking at the fall, I believe you're hiring a lot of off-the-bus reporters, aren't you, to go out and kind of report on what is happening?
Well, Off the Bus has the same principle. We put out requests for particular assignments. So the latest one that you're probably referring to is Amanda Mikkels, who is the director of Off the Bus. Her blog asking people to come on board the special ops, as we are calling it, which is basically going around the country and reporting on the field operations of the two campaigns all around the country, which is much easier to do if you have over 3,000 citizen journalists now scattered around the country. You don't have to fly them there.
Exactly.
And they can go and really send us pictures, send us reports, profile the key people of the field operation of the two campaigns. We just finished a project with Off the Bus looking at how the media are covering John McCain. So Off the Bus is a great opportunity to use distributive journalism, to use the wisdom of the crowds to report on different parts of the campaign.
Is part of the Huffington Post a reaction to what's happening with newspapers? I mean, we all know how much original reporting is done by some of the nation's leading newspapers, and they've never been perhaps more important, but they've also never been in such jeopardy. Is part of what you're trying to do essentially saying to newspapers, look, this is how you can adapt with journalism? Is that part of sort of the modus operandi of what you're doing?
Not really. I feel that a lot of newspapers are already moving online and are already doing a lot of great things online. If there was any motivation that had to do with newspapers in our founding, it had to do with our discontent with the way the mainstream media covered the war in Iraq and the lead up to the war, and with the way that they lost all of their credibility by becoming stenographers to power. Okay. So that was more the reaction. But I think there's great reporting being done by mainstream newspapers. There was great reporting being done in the lead up to the war, by Knight Ridder, by Walter Pincus of the Washington Post. I never saw this as an either-or battle. Okay. I see what we are doing as really taking the best of traditional journalism, fact-checking, accuracy, truth-seeking, and I see, many great newspapers moving more and more online and integrating that in their reporting.
I'm wondering also, when you look at some of the entertainment elements that are part of the Huffington Post, is that by design? Because again, when you think of when you think of the way that you structure an online newspaper and news community, are you worried in terms of, for instance, the Huffington Post, first of all, having a point of view on a lot of issues, but also the idea of having some celebrity bloggers and celebrity stories? How are you trying to balance that idea of credibility with getting, readership where people are truly interested in all kinds of different stories?
Well, credibility for me has to do with facts. If you're factual, you're credible. We are deliberately expanding the Huffington Post to many areas beyond politics, because we don't want just to speak to the choir. We don't want just to address people who agree with us. And it has really been a great way to get people come to the Huffington Post who are not even particularly political, who come through the entertainment page or the media page, and or our comedy site, 23/6. Now we are launching local. We're moving into different cities in the country, including Chicago, which is our first city.
I'm wondering also, you're originally from Greece, you're educated in the United Kingdom, and I'm wondering, does that give you a different perspective on America? Do you view America perhaps through a different lens than a lot of people that are kind of native born? And also, does that in any way lead to a caricature of you or misconceptions about you that you don't feel are fair?
Obviously, the fact that I'm Greek gives me this sort of outsider perspective on America,
right.
Which I think is very helpful when it comes to challenging the conventional wisdom. I was in England last week, and I went to school in England and lived there for 10 years. And it was really sort of great to see the European perspective on what's happening, including the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, how much more central to their coverage, say, the war in Afghanistan is than the war in Iraq is here. More concerned about it. Some were critical, some were less critical, but there was a lot of analysis, a lot of pictures, while now we see how Iraq is becoming a little bit the forgotten war in America.
It's interesting, too, maybe my last question for you is that towards the end of your book, you say that it's really up to us to change things, to be more conscious, to challenge our political leaders. If it's up to each of us to step up, what do you recommend that we do? Again, just people that don't perhaps have the levers of power close by to them. What does an average person do if they want to make a difference?
Well, that's what is so exciting about this moment in our political life. The fact that we can, through the internet, through making our voices heard, have an immediate impact. And then taking what's happening on the internet and translating it into organizing has never been kind of more effective. And that means that we all have this responsibility that I write about at the end of the book to look in the mirror and discover the leader inside us and tap into that leadership potential instead of always looking outside to the knight on the white charger to save us.
Right, it's up to us.
Yes.
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.